Welcome back to Pop Culture. Also this week, I wanted to talk about a sort of funny guy who may or may not be the father of cultural studies in the sense of studying what popular culture is. The irony, of course, is that he hated it. He hated popular culture. He thought it would bring anarchy, thus the title of his book, right? Matthew Arnold. He thought effectively, and this is simplifying things, of course, but there is the great culture. So William Shakespeare, for example. And then there is this popular folk, tavern culture where people are singing and getting drunk, or where people are reading from the penny presses and they're just bad stories or whatever it is, right? What we would probably call popular culture today, he would call anarchy. And he was scared that the more people get exposed to that and the less they get exposed to the great works of the great masters, which were almost inevitably straight, rich, white guys, usually from the same country as the person talking about it. He thought that it would just lead to the downfall of England in this case, but also you get the same or similar arguments from a lot of people, and it's interesting. We'll see this theme a lot, right? It's often the rich white property owners who think that the workers or the women or the children are at risk, and that they know what people should and shouldn't be reading, what they should and shouldn't be listening to. And in fact, think about maybe your own experience. You've probably seen that kind of thing in the last year, where some some self-appointed moral entrepreneur, they might call them, they usually don't call themselves that, but we can call them that from a sociological point of view. They will say, like, children should not be listening to whatever, or the reason that poor people are poor is because they partake in these activities. And it's it's an interesting sort of framework that has been around for a very long time, and we see it in Culture and Anarchy. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to expose you to that, to an excerpt from that book. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, based on that excerpt, and of course you're welcome to read more, you could probably find the whole book online. What do you agree with and what do you disagree with? Because I want you to treat everything you're going to read in this class as if there is someone worthy of listening to, even if I disagree with that person. And I'm going to assess what they have to say, usually about culture, and I'm going to sort of break down what they're saying and evaluate why I think their arguments are maybe severely flawed or actually quite worthy of paying attention to. And the more you do that, the better you'll get at articulating how culture works, how popular culture works, and the better you'll be at identifying the different debates that are going on. So one of them, as you'll see, is basically what's good for people, and should we be telling people what to watch, what to listen to, what to read, and if we should, who should be doing that? These self-appointed moral entrepreneurs who usually are, these rich white guys who want to tell people how people should be more like them is effectively what they're saying. That kind of translates sometimes into the university system and the college system, but it's also, of course, been changing significantly in the last few decades, particularly. You'll also notice that the further back we go, usually more people hate popular culture, or what we would now call popular culture, and the closer you get to the present, the more people are willing to engage with it and accept it as a worthy thing to study, for starters, but also not necessarily bad or evil or corrupting. In fact, maybe it has some great values. In fact, it's gone so far that one might argue that current scholars of popular culture are actually getting a little bit back to that and saying, here's the ideological problems with it, here's why people should be doing this and not that. Although, for the most part, I'd say scholars are much more open to that. One of the reasons they're much more open to that is because of a great scholar, a little bit more contemporary compared to Matthew Arnold, called Raymond Williams. We'll get to him shortly, but I just want to read this thing that's on my computer, this quote from him. He says that the analysis of culture is the clarification of the meanings and values, implicit and explicit, in a particular way of life, a particular culture. One of the ways that we're going to study this broad subject is by thinking about exactly what that sentence means. And if you break it down a little bit, and I'll ask you some questions about it perhaps on the website, but if you break it down, think about it. To analyze culture on a very basic level, you are clarifying, you're making it clearer what people may feel they already know or what you may feel you already know, but you're articulating the meanings and the values, implicit and explicit, in a particular way of life or a particular culture. So, the reason he emphasizes the particular is because if I were to tell you what Shakespeare means, today, Shakespeare means something significantly different. In fact, I would argue that he's a representation of sort of this old hegemonic way of thinking of what is good. Not that he's a bad person or that he's a bad writer, of course, but now he kind of represents a stodgy old establishment English lesson as opposed to popular culture. But if I were to talk to you during his time when he was having people perform his plays and people were chucking stuff at the actors and shouting at them and stomping their feet and all stuck together and smelling horrible, I'm sure, because of the culture at the time, which was a normal thing. You could easily say that it's pop culture and it's corrupting the masses and people should really be reading Virgil or something, right? So it changes significantly depending on the particular time, the particular place, and the particular contexts that are involved. So there's no such thing as studying Shakespeare when it comes to cultural studies. You study Shakespeare during his time or during the early 19th century when people were most interested in this aspect of his work, or during the 21st century when people have started to ask questions about gender and identity, for example. So you don't study Shakespeare, you study Shakespeare here or there when it comes to a culture. And that goes for all cultural artifacts, all cultural practices. Another important thing is the difference between implicit and explicit, right? So implicit doesn't come out and say it. And most of the interesting things that we'll study and that we'll talk about, that's where the value lies or the interest lies, is in the things that are not explicitly said. Sometimes you do want to get explicit and you want to say, this person said these words and here's how we can unpack that to understand more about that culture. But oftentimes you want to say, here's what we see, but here's what's implied by the way it's represented or by the choice of using this as opposed to that aesthetic. And these are the questions that we're going to be asking much more than the explicit. Oftentimes it's good to start with the explicit, but then you want to get to the implicit. And that's what you want to do. So again, the analysis of culture. You want to tattoo this to your forearm or your thigh or reversed on your forehead so that you can read it in a mirror maybe. I encourage you to do that. Maybe not, but it's a good sentence to memorize because it'll help you in every essay that you're going to write in this class. The analysis of culture is the clarification of the meanings and values, implicit and explicit, in a particular way of life, a particular culture. And so moving on from that, let's think for a moment about what we might call high and low culture. So I'm going to show you some images of high and low culture, and I'm going to ask you to tell me a little bit more about how high and low culture works in your particular experience. So as we said, every culture has a particular way of life and a particular set of implicit and explicit expectations, meanings, values. So think about if I were to come to a party and I were to present sort of like the game we played earlier where I give you 3 things and you have to guess which fits or which you think would fit with my personality and what you know about me and my cultural values. Imagine, I come to your party and I bring a 25-year-old bottle of cognac from Paris, or I bring a 6-pack of Pat's Blue Ribbon beer, or I bring a Californian Zinfandel wine. Those things mean very different things. Even though what you're doing is just saying, hey, I brought drinks to your party, they have very different implicit meanings. And some are highbrow in the sense that, you might think like to appreciate a fine cognac, you really need to know how it's made and how it's manufactured and where it's coming from and the terroir of the place from which the original grapes were cultivated. That's a very highbrow concept, not necessarily in all cases. I mean, if you were going to a block party, right, it would be weird to bring a bottle of cognac. But when you compare that to a PBR is usually like the cheapest beer you can find in the grocery store. And so that would be a more sort of lowbrow thing. And they have very different values in cultural contexts, right? Same as if I were to come to a park, let's say, and I were to be reading a book, and it would be either Tolstoy, right? A big, thick volume of Tolstoy, or if I were to be reading the newest, like Dan Brown novel, like the Da Vinci Code style stuff, or if I were to be reading, I don't know, what's another popular thing right now? 50 Shades of Grey, right? Think about the difference in how you might look at me if you're walking by and you see this guy. In one version of this, he's reading Tolstoy. In another version of this, he's reading 50 Shades of Grey, right? There are immediate sort of cultural implications, sort of implied meanings. So not just, oh, he's reading that book, which is explicit, but oh, he must be very highbrow or very lowbrow, or he must be coming from this kind of cultural identity or atmosphere versus another. And so that's another thing I want you to do this week, is think about your own life and use these charts as examples. The kind of cool thing about these are they're historical in a sense. They're not something that you're likely to identify with yourself, but the practice of saying, well, that's expensive, it's difficult to understand, and it's exclusive, therefore it's probably highbrow, that applies to almost all cases. And the reverse is also true, right? If it's cheap, if it's widely available, and if it doesn't really require any knowledge, it's probably more lowbrow. And I'm not saying that this is how you should see the world. And I'm not saying that you should all aspire to be highbrow and not lowbrow. That's definitely not what I'm saying. But one of the ways that we can understand how culture works is by thinking about not just what the thing is, but what it signifies on an implicit level. So again, if you're walking around with watching a film, and you explained that it was a film that had mostly fart jokes, that's going to register on a different level and imply different things about you and your values than if you were to say, yeah, I watched the most recent Oscar-nominated film from last year. I found it, a contemporary film that illustrates the struggle of modern life in a small rural town in New Mexico, and whatever the case, right? These are very, very different assumptions that you're providing, that you're signifying to other people. So I want you to think a little bit about how that works in your life. Again, it varies from person to person. I mean, in some cases, you might get more what Pierre Bourdieu calls cultural capital, and that might allow you to say, well, I know these things, and I've read these books, and I've done these activities, and therefore, effectively, I'm higher than you on the social status ladder. But not always, right? In some cases, it might backfire. You might come to a party and bring the finest bottle of Napoleon brandy that you could find, and people will be like, what the hell are you doing? This is not how we operate here in Young Harris, Georgia, or whatever. And so it wouldn't actually help you necessarily, even though in a different context, maybe people would be like, oh, wow, that's a very expensive bottle. You must have very fine taste. So on a general level, this is how culture works in various ways, and it's been an important touchstone of cultural debates that you continue to see in presidential elections and local school board debates about what books should or should not be included and why. And it was something that Matthew Arnold was already worried about. Again, I mean, look at this handsome guy, right? How could this guy not know what the best things in the world are? I mean, the barber alone that he chose to style his sideburns clearly was the best that had been produced by humanity. But yeah, who gets to say what is good and what is not good? Who gets to say what is culture and then what is popular? Which again, in this case, is popular as if it were shit, as if it was garbage, as if you might as well literally be hanging out at the local dump because that's what you're doing by watching these shows or listening to this music or reading these books, right? He was worried about this and appointed himself a guardian, in a sense, of culture. And there are a lot of implications to that. But are there any good implications, perhaps? I mean, how would you feel if, going back to that earlier example, your kids were given 50 Shades of Grey in one school and Tolstoy in another? I mean, I don't want to say that one would necessarily be better than the other, but I can imagine that a lot of parents would choose one school over the other. And so these debates, they continue in different forms, and sometimes they get very heated, and sometimes they're not that big a deal until we realize like we've just wiped out a whole section of what people are interested in because we didn't find it high enough. And oftentimes it's not correct to say that's highbrow or that's lowbrow, which literally goes to this idea of like you have a big head, and so if you have a big head and you have a high brow, then you're very smart, and if you have a low brow, then you're like a Neanderthal. I mean, that's like the metaphor that's being used and that we continue to use, although we don't necessarily use those terms anymore. But there is a strong sense that some things are higher than others. And that's really why I wanted you to read this essay. So I want you to think about that. And then I have a few challenges for you on the website. Not supposed to be super difficult, but what I really want you to think about, the big overarching question is, how do we know what's good for us or not? Can we know what's good for us or not? And who, if anyone, should be telling us what's good for us or not when it comes to culture and the cultural practices that we do on an everyday basis, the books we read, the films we watch. Should you be doing it? Should I be doing it? Should Matthew Arnold and his sideburns be doing it? It doesn't seem like a big question until a politician or until a local minister or what have you says we need to condemn these people or these books or these practices, and we're going to burn all of these comics, or we're going to get rid of any Jewish writers going back to World War II. And then we see how important the implicit and explicit values are of the things that we do, the practices that we get involved in, and how we not only do them, but what it means when we do them, what it signifies when we choose to read these books and not those books, or listen to this music and not that music. And what are you doing? That's what it comes down to as well. In your life, what are you signifying when you listen to the music that you listen to? What are you signifying when you read the books or comics or play the video games that you are choosing? What are you telling other people? And how do you think that they read that? And should anyone be held to a higher standard, or should any be permitted and not permitted? These are some of the big debates that we'll continue with throughout the term. Start thinking about it. Tell me what you agree with or disagree with in terms of the excerpt from Matthew Arnold, and send me any questions you might have. Don't forget I put up that Ask Me Anything box, and I encourage you literally to ask me anything, especially as you're reading about this and you're wondering, what does this really mean, or how does this fit with something else? As time goes by, you'll have those kinds of questions, and so will a lot of people. People are nervous about asking them sometimes, so I put up this anonymous thing. You can ask me anything. That said, enjoy week 2. I will see you, and I look forward to seeing your videos of your 3 objects, 2 of which are true, 1 of which is a lie, and we will try to figure out which is which next week, and we'll get to know each other a little better as well. Take care.